Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kendra Yoch.
And I'm Amy Dickerson.
Welcome to the 10th webinar in our Franczek Educational Equity Series. Amy and I continue to be your moderators for this monthly series that will run throughout the year. During the series, we're exploring how school districts can identify and break down systemic barriers that are depriving students of equitable educational opportunities, how to more intentionally allocate resources based on need, and use the law as a driver for internal reforms to support our most vulnerable student populations. These conversations may not always be comfortable, but they're critical to helping making meaningful and positive changes in our public school systems. Today, we'll be discussing how districts are using school and district level equity teams to develop and reach their equity goals. We're excited to welcome Mr. Tony Medina, principal at Palatine High School in Township High School District 211. Hello. Dr. Rob Lang, Assistant Superintendent for Staff Services at Community High School District 99. Welcome. And Shawn Messmer, Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Innovation at Maine Township High School District 207. Welcome. As well as Franczek Partner Michael Hernandez. Welcome to you. We're going to be talking about the models utilized in each of our speakers' districts, strategies for engaging a variety of stakeholders, and maintaining strong leadership, momentum, and continuity. We'll also dig in a bit to the equity goals contained in ISBE's 2020-2023 strategic plan, including the plan for incorporating an Equity Journey Continuum tool into each district's public report card by the 2022 reporting year. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us. We're so happy that everyone is here today. Please do submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. That's easier for us to keep track of. We'll do our best to answer your questions. And if we don't get to your questions, please do follow up. So we'll get started. To set some background, let's begin our discussion by having each of our administrators tell us briefly about the districts that they currently serve. Shawn, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Maine Township High School District 207 is made up of 4 schools, 3 high schools and 1 alternative school, all 9 through 12. I could give you the district demographics, but I think it's important to hear from each school because we have 3 very different schools. And so at Maine East High School, we're 30% Asian, 20% Latinx, 40% white, 5% Black, with a 38% free and reduced population. At West, we're 12% Asian, 40% Latinx, 40% white, and 4% Black, with 32% free and reduced. And then at Maine South, we're 86% white, 4% Asian, 9% Latinx, 1% Black, with only 5% free and reduced. So we have a pretty diverse population and 3 very different schools.
Thanks. Tony?
Sure. We have Township High School District 211. We have 5 traditional high schools with 2 alternative high schools, roughly 12,000 students. We go back and forth with District 214, which is the largest high school district in Illinois. As a whole, our district is 43% white, 26% Hispanic, 21% Asian, and 6% Black. I only have two of the schools' data currently available. Our own school here at Palatine, we are 49% Hispanic, approximately 36% white, I believe 8% Asian, and about 6% Black. Conant High School I also have, which is in the middle of the range. We have 5 very, very different high schools. Conant High School is 45% white, 28% Asian, 18% Hispanic, and 3.8% Black. So very different. Like I said, there's 2 schools that are pretty much on the opposite ends of the spectrum, which is normally Palatine as well as Fremd High School, but also a school like Conant, which is right in the middle of our 2 schools' demographics.
Okay, thanks. How about you, Rob?
All right. Hi, everybody. We're a smaller school district. So we're Community High School District 99, which is in Downers Grove. We have 2 large high schools and a smaller transition center. Across all of our campuses, we have about 4,800 students. 65% are white, 8% Black, 17% Hispanic, and 7% Asian.
Good. So we've got kind of a little bit of a variety across our high school districts, which is good. I think it's nice to have people come in with some different perspectives.
Absolutely. Well, so now that we've got that background, it would be great to hear from each of you with regard to how your equity teams are set up at your district and at the district level and the school level, as well as some background as to how you arrived at that structure. So Tony, would you like to start?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a little background about Palatine High School as well. We started this process about 6 to 7 years ago. And, you know, we go back when you look at the Illinois school report card, you know, in 2005 or 2006, I believe our student demographics were 74% white and 22% Hispanic. Fast forward to today, like I said, we are, you know, 48, 49% Hispanic and 36% white. So our school started doing this. We had some teachers, and it's been really teacher driven, which has been fantastic because you want boots on the ground, you know, want people who are the front lines working with our students to really push this and want to support their fellow staff members in this process. So we started this quite a few years ago as a school. And I know each school in District 211 had their own approach over the last 6 to 7 years, but last year in August of 2020, as our nation was going through its own issues, you know, our district formed the District 211 equity team, and it was composed of students, parents, staff members, as well as school administrators and district administrators. And it focused on you know, initially we looked at a few different schools and districts across the state of Illinois, some across the country, to see what their plans look like. But we came up with 4 main priorities that we wanted to focus on in District 211. One was equitable practices and mindsets, equitable opportunity and achievement, equitable curriculum and instruction, and school, family, and community partnerships. After doing this work throughout the 2020-2021 school year, I think each subcommittee met approximately 10 to 12 times for about 2 hours at a time. It really was a lot of work for students and parents to be there. I mean, a lot of us who are administrators, we do this work every single day, but for those students and parents to be involved so heavily was outstanding. And we were really able to get some tremendous feedback from those people who are you know, most important stakeholders. As we've transitioned through this last year, our district has approved our equity program to move forward. And each school now has their own 4 subcommittees consisting of those same 4 priorities that I just spoke of.
Rob, do you want to share next?
Sure, yeah. So similar to what Tony said, District 99 has been on this journey for many years. As I count back, I think it's about 7 or 8 years. And that started with a PD program and a small group of staff who were leading that. And we have a really strong culture of when we have new initiatives or things that we're changing about our school district, that we do our best to make that staff-led. So in 2017 is when we decided to scale up significantly our equity efforts. And with that, we established a district-wide equity team. The people we chose to be on that team was intentional, a cross-section of different job roles, so that way we could have many different perspectives that are on there. We also knew at that time that this was going to involve a lot of professional learning. And one area of growth for us was to engage our adults who aren't in classroom settings in professional learning. So we knew that we had to have those voices at the table too, to figure out how we could design experiences for them. So we met as a district-wide team for about 2 years of doing some learning together, building some leadership capacity, and then starting our implementation. And then really the great thing that we discovered is that once we got momentum rolling, more people wanted to take on leadership roles on the committee. And so that single committee just became too large for us to meet in one setting. So with that, we then divided it and said, we're going to have building-based teams. And some of those people on the building teams are then still on the district team. So we built a little bit of an organizational structure. So what we have now is in our 2 high schools, they each have a building-based team. We have an administrator in each of those high schools who's leading the coordination of those teams, but we get really great feedback and ideas. And then we bring that together and then establish what we're going to focus on the few years after that. So that's the structure we have right now, and it's ever evolving. So it'll change as we keep moving forward.
Great, thanks, Rob. Shawn?
Yeah, so we're in year 3 of our equity journey. It actually started at district office with just a group of us getting together who had some experience in buildings and just some things going on in our community that we really felt this was the direction we wanted to head. We knew that, schools like 211, Evanston, Highland Park had been doing the work for a while, and we really wanted to get started with it. So we actually started with a seed cohort, which was a very diverse group of staff members, from paraprofessionals through district office personnel, which really helped plant the seed to move it really down to be a teacher-led and building-led endeavor. Once people were exposed to that and did their own personal work within the seed cohort, it really, this moved up on our priority list, which we were very happy about. So now we currently have a district team. We started with one big team, but we now currently have a district team that meets monthly. And then each of our buildings has an equity team. And so that district team has liaisons from each of the buildings on it, which meets monthly. And so as alluded to, once you have that big team, you get a lot of people who are energized, but it also becomes very difficult to lead. And get all voices heard. And so that's what really led to creating the building teams, just to be a more efficient model. And plus, they're on the ground. They're dealing with the students every day, the teachers every day. They're the ones that are hearing things about the community that sometimes we're just missing at district office. And so it really made sense for this to be a homegrown in each of the buildings. And particularly, because of the diversity in the buildings and the three buildings being so different. And so while they might be dealing with similar issues, it's never quite the same in each of those buildings because of the demographics. And so that's been a structure that's worked really well for us, and we're going to continue. But we just made that change this year. So it wouldn't surprise me if in a year or two we're making adjustments, as Rob alluded to.
Well, listen, thanks to the panels for that. So what you're describing is a decentralized approach, which seems to be working in the school districts. So can we talk about what are the benefits and challenges of this decentralized approach? For example, responsibility, accountability, broad support. And then the second component, maybe if we can talk about, and how do your teams determine where to focus or what to work on? Tony, 211, how are you all doing it down there?
So it's really interesting because we have such a large high school district with such different high schools. I mean, our populations, we each have our own challenges. One of our schools faced a lot of mental health issues in the last 2 years. We've faced a disconnect of wanting to attract more of our families to come into the building, to be more engaged in the educational process, right? So that support, that ability to focus on our own priorities has been fantastic. I think for us, specifically as a school, like one of our main focuses this year is to strengthen our relationship between our school, family, and community partnerships. In years past, we were really on the right track. We were pushing our parent university where we were getting hundreds and hundreds of people coming in throughout the school year. And now since COVID-19 has hit us, we've seen a huge drop off, and it's almost like we're having to start from scratch. And I know like some of the other schools just have their own priorities. And I think the mental health issue is hitting a couple of our schools hard. So they're able to focus hard on that with their own populations. I think a challenge though, is that because of being in 5 high schools, we're all in the same district. Sometimes some people want us to be completely aligned. And we're hearing a lot of that from the communities to make sure that we're all aligned in almost, lockstep at times. We can't do that. It's very hard to do that based on our populations. I'll give you an example is like SAT prep. Some of our schools can offer SAT prep in the evenings or after school, and some can't based on their diverse populations. Some schools have students that have after school jobs, they have to attend and support their siblings. So some schools have these large numbers of SAT prep hours in the evenings, while others have different ways to attract that or to attack that during the school day. And that's come up as an issue because when people see certain hours offered throughout the course of the day, there's and it's not aligned, it causes issues, and it's an equity issue, and we have to adjust on that. So because of that, because of the 5 high school district, sometimes, even though it's decentralized, we have to go back to that alignment because sometimes the public wants that.
Thank you. So you mentioned 2 points, COVID, which has affected everything, including equity work. As well as community and parent involvement, which is a hot issue right now. So thank you for that information. Rob, how about your approach in District 99 with the decentralized issues?
Yeah, so in District 99, we have a decentralized leadership structure. We phrase it as there's really three executives in our district. There's the superintendent, and then there's the two principals. And all of us who work in the central office are there to support the principals and their teams and their priorities. So that's naturally led us into a model for our equity implementation that's also decentralized. I see a lot of really great benefits to it because the principals and their teams are closer to the students, they're closer to the staff, which allows them to be more responsive to the needs. You know, we as a district-wide committee might design a PD session and facilitate that session. And then based off that feedback, maybe one campus needs to go deeper or one campus has realized they need to go a different route. And the decentralized structure really allows for that flexibility for the principals and their teams. The challenge though is similar to what Tony was talking about is we still want to make sure that as a district, we're driving in the same direction. So that's really what my role is, and the people who serve on the district-wide committee with me is to be that liaison between the board goals, the strategic goals every year, and the work that the building-based equity teams want to do. So I feel like we have a pretty good balance where they come back and say, here's what we want to do, and then I make sure that it's all directed in the same way. However, you know, there will have to be some centralized decisions coming up in the future as we evaluate curriculum, because we're very strong on a common experience curricular-wise across both schools. And so that's going to lead us more into a centralized decision-making in those areas.
Thank you for that insight. Maine Township, Shawn, what's been your experience?
So yeah, we very deliberately have stayed away from just having it sit in one person's hand like an equity director. And just because we want everyone to own the work. And when that happens, you know, you do get that decentralized and we can be very responsive to each of the things that are going on in the buildings. And so a benefit has been that it allows for that uniqueness of each building. You know, a school like East, before we started the equity work, people felt they knew equity because we had such a diverse student population. Until you really start to dive in and do the work and you realize, well, wow, I was missing so much. And so where they are on their journey, kind of as Tony pointed out, they're in a very different spot than like a Maine South or a Maine West. And that decentralized approach allows them to keep taking the steps in the right direction. But I can say that none of our three buildings are at the same place at the same time. And I think that's been a good thing because it's been super responsive to the kids and families. The downside of that, though, is sort of what Tony alluded to also earlier, which is why is East or West or South doing something that one of the others isn't doing? And so it's my job to answer those questions, support our principals and our buildings in that journey, and really help with the pacing to get folks what they need when they need it, so they can maybe speed up a little bit, and at the same time slow down some of our other buildings, so that, quite frankly, they don't get out over their skis on an issue, and sort of so that we can ensure that we can continue to do the work. So, you know, it becomes like, I think all three of us here as administrators know that when you're an administrator, sometimes it's like herding cats. And this is one that's kind of similar to that, to make sure that everybody's getting what they need.
Thank you. This is a good segue to our next topic, and that seems to be the gathering of information. And Rob, maybe you can share with us, but the specific questions are, have you conducted an audit or collected information in other ways to learn about equity issues and how they're playing out in your schools? And then second, how has that information informed the work that you have done and what you are focused on now in your program? Rob, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that team, district-wide team I talked about in 2017, the initial work for that team was implementing and scaling up professional learning, building an awareness about our equity work, opening up conversations. In year 2 of that team meeting, though, we knew that wasn't, like, there was so much more that we had to do. And so in our conversations, we became aware of this idea of an equity audit. None of us knew what it was or how to do it, but just in our reading and our research, we felt like that's our next step to give us some guidance on where we should be heading. So with that, we partnered with the DuPage Regional Office of Education for them to do an audit. First, because we didn't know how to do it. And second, we wanted authentic information. So we didn't want a power dynamic to somehow be inserted into the collection of information. So they had an individual who came out, conducted the audit. There was a lot of quantitative, so grades, attendance, course enrollments, things like that. And then there was also qualitative. So the equity team got an opportunity to vet the questions that would be asked for the focus groups. And then the person performing the audit went and did those interviews and did that qualitative. And then they produced a report for us. So at the end of the report are some recommendations based off of the information that they have. And we've been working through those recommendations. Unfortunately, the report was turned into us right about the time that COVID happened, right? So our priorities suddenly shifted. However, we didn't take our eyes off of it. There's two things that we're doing. One is this year is our time to start over with our strategic planning for the district. And so those recommendations from the audit is going to be part of our data set that's used for our strategic planning. The other thing is that there are some recommendations in there that we've started to implement. So for example, one of them was that we should find a way to regularly survey our students and our staff of what their experiences are and help us to identify ways that we can change. So we started doing that during the pandemic because we needed to check in with all of our stakeholders. And now with this year, we went back to the audit and said, well, wait a second, we know how to do this now. We've partnered with a company. Now let's just build that in as part of our structure. And then that helps us to achieve one of the recommendations in the audit. So I'm looking forward to the strategic planning work that we have this year because we can then really digest those recommendations and build it into a long-term plan.
Great. Shawn, any experience in gathering this type of information for your district?
So our original equity team at the district level, the larger team, got together and we kind of did our own audit internally. We looked at what some other districts had found and sort of what was on their strategic plans about where they were headed. And that really kind of was the lens through which we started to look at some things within the district to set some priorities and then assign those roles to various members of the team to move some very specific things forward. So we didn't use an outside organization to do the audit. But one of the conversations we have been having is, do we want to do that in the next couple of years to see what's still out, like what are the things that we may have even attempted to do that didn't work very well, or we still need to do a lot of work on. And then also we did start using, about the same time we started our equity journey, the panorama survey. And so we do that twice a year to collect from both staff and students this sort of school climate and culture data. And we have some very specific questions regarding the equity initiatives that we've put in place to see if we're moving the needle at all or not on those. So that's the way we've approached it.
Thank you. Tony, any experience with either internal review or utilizing an outside resource?
Yeah, so last year we contracted an outside company to conduct an equity audit, and it's called B. Young and Associates. We worked with last year, and they performed audits with students, parents, staff members, support staff, administrators. Focusing on the following subgroups are white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian groups. And one of the things I found really interesting, and this was strictly qualitative. I know Rob mentioned qualitative and quantitative data. This is strictly qualitative. It was how people really are perceiving, how they are welcomed in school, how they are treated in school. It was strictly a qualitative approach that gave you some recommendations as well, just like Rob mentioned. But one of the things of note is that each subgroup that had an audit had a facilitator that was from that same background. And that really promoted, and even when I was interviewed, I also felt like you could be a little bit more honest with somebody that you could connect with like that. And it was interesting because I felt like people were very honest. Nothing was overly surprising in the results, in terms of how, certain groups were feeling, but I felt like it really allowed us to, to focus on certain things, using that qualitative data to formulate our priorities that I've already talked about. You know, and that was a major part in formulating those priorities. Now, in terms of quantitative data, our district administration, so our superintendent and all of our assistant superintendents, as well as our principals, you know, we started doing a data retreat. We did a data retreat to look at what are some of the issues that we're facing and how we could provide more equitable outcomes. And looking at data such as graduation rate, you know, behavior referrals, things of that nature, and driving it towards our strategic plan. As we started, you know, this will be the first year of our brand new 5-year strategic plan, which just ended from the 2016 strategic plan that we had. And it's based a lot on the audit, but also the data, the quantitative data that we were able to look at as we performed that data retreat as a district. Lastly, we also are using Panorama. Panorama has been very useful in especially at our school. You know, we focused on last summer. Somebody asked me, what's our golden calf for equity this year? What are we looking at? What do we want? And we said, we want kids to feel like they belong. And Panorama has definitely provided us the data on whether or not students feel like they belong. So Panorama is going to be a big part of our plan moving forward.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, I think that's a great, you know, your comments there, Tony, can take us really into kind of, you know, asking and kind of talking a little bit more about each of your priorities this school year in light of the structures you have in place, but the obvious, you know, difficult year that we're coming off of and the difficulties that schools are facing this year, having come off of last school year. Can you each talk a bit more about what your priorities are this school year for your equity teams and what your teams are doing to advance those goals? Shawn, do you want to start?
Sure. This year we're really focused on curriculum. So with the changes that have come down from the state regarding equity and inclusion, it's a nice start to the conversation that it's helping us leverage going through each department very deliberately to have that conversation about inclusion. And so we're not calling them equity audits, we're calling them inclusion audits. Because we really want to make sure that our students can see themselves and can be engaged in the curriculum we're delivering. And we're not so sure that they can right now. And so we'll be starting next month with student listening groups, focus groups, and surveys to work through what are the places that we think we're doing pretty well with including the voices of our students of color, our students who have other challenges, physical and otherwise, LGBTQ, as well as seeing through each discipline, like having teachers sit on that panel to hear what the kids are actually saying. And so we're just going to work through each of our departments. We hopefully are going to start getting through social science and English this year. And if that process works well, you know, we'll continue with our other disciplines. And so we're actually following a similar model to Evanston, who's been doing this work for a very long time and has a really nice model for a curriculum review.
Great. Tony, I know you've touched on it. Do you want to talk a bit more about your priorities for the school year?
Absolutely. So each school in our district chose 4 priorities to focus on for this school year. And that's that decentralized approach that we already talked about. So as a school, like at Palatine, we're focusing on ensuring that our school climate and school culture promote a safe and inclusive environment. We're focusing on social emotional learning in the classroom. We're also focusing on strengthening our relationships, which I also talked about recently, briefly, was between all stakeholders. And implementation new systems of support. I feel like that's something that we are still looking at, like what sort of systems we can put in place to support our underrepresented students who are, you know, and using that quantitative data that I spoke about briefly as well on how to improve that, right? Our district, though, actually has its own priorities. Of those 16 priorities, I know, you know, one of the things that kept coming up in every single audit from all the subgroups was the hiring of teachers of color that match the demographics of the school. And I know our district is really looking into that and how to change the process, the hiring process and the recruitment process. Also, you know, as a 5 high school district, the other thing is curriculum. Our district is going to be focusing on curriculum and how to adjust so that students can see themselves in the curriculum. I know those are 2 of their priorities. I could go on and on the other ones, but I think those two are the priority right now that we can fix, right? I think one of the things that districts sometimes run into, and any sort of equity team that we run into, is a lack of action, right? Short-term action. I think that's one of those things that we've talked about a lot as a district and as a school, is what can we do now to make sure that we don't lose momentum? When I think about that as a school, like some of the things that we were able to do, we've added new courses, we've added Latinx studies, we've added Latinx literature, African-American literature, and these were fantastic opportunities for students to be able to see themselves in the curriculum. And I think there's also been a drive to hire more diverse staff. I think, we need to start thinking outside the box as a school, as a district, on how we're going to find candidates that match our demographics. Cold calls, we recruit universities, athletic teams. As a school at Palatine, we've hired nearly 20 certified educators and administrators of color in the last 3 years. And I know that's the short-term action that we can do that's going to keep the work moving forward.
Great, thank you. Rob, can you share some of your priorities this school year?
Yeah, so in areas of my work, we're on this multi-year journey of significantly redesigning professional learning for our adults. And there's elements that touched into our construction, there's elements that touches into our new teacher training. But overall with our staff is that we want to move away from the model that we've had in the past, which is that a topic of PD gets its own little silo and a few moments of attention, and then we move on to another topic, to more of an integrated approach. So one of the recommendations also from our audit was to find ways that we can treat equity and embed it within our PD rather than just having it stand alone on its own. So that's what I've been working on with some of my teams this year, is really going through all the different PD that we have and working with the facilitators or instructional coaches in finding ways that they can make inroads to having equity conversations with the adults that they work with. So we started that work a few years ago, and we're continuing that work with the goal being that anytime there's a conversation about anything that an adult wants to grow professionally, that we're finding inroads to have those conversations about equity in those moments rather than isolated PD events talking specifically around equity.
Great, thank you. Well, and I know we've done, in past, some of our some of the critical issues that you have raised, including hiring diverse educators and administrators. In looking at the, kind of what's on the horizon here, Mike, do you want to talk a bit about what we're seeing out of the Illinois State Board of Education in terms of their strategic plan, their equity goals, and what we anticipate, them incorporating into district report cards coming up here in, the next couple years, in terms of having shining a spotlight, so to say, on where districts are at in terms of their equity work and some of these different areas that have been explored in the audits that Tony, Shawn, and Rob have talked about?
Sure, I'd love to do that. As the former general counsel from ISBE, the philosophy was always policy is established at ISBE, and then support for the districts, some guides, some tools. And so as part of the Illinois State Board of Education 2020 to 2023 strategic plan, there are goals that are set up. And one of the major goals is equity, the equity goal. Of course, all the goals are important. And within the equity goals, there are internal and external focuses. So for example, internally, an equity impact analysis tool will guide all decisions and communications provided to the field. Well, I think our experts, and I'll call our panelists experts because they do it every day, I've talked about that, about the gathering of information, about climate, about audit assessments. But again, ISBE is working through their equity advisory committee, providing other tools, rubrics to help out the districts. The second piece is external, right? Transparency, and we'll talk a little about that in our next piece as well. But an equity journey continuum will be used to publicly indicate where each Illinois school district is on in its equity journey. So what does that mean? What is that? How does that get implemented? How does ISBE work with the districts? Well, at the September Equity Advisory Committee meeting, the recommendation was that the Equity Journey Curriculum Continuum tool will be researched, developed, and incorporated into each district's public report card by the 2022 reporting year. So that's on the horizon. Again, that's part of the transparency and the public reporting component of it. The districts should keep an eye on that. I know that the committee has established certain rubrics and factors that they will be looking at as this continuum, this equity continuum journey is being part of the equity goal and how to meet it. Well, I know we have a question in the in our Q&A here, and it's on a subject that we need to face, and that is transparency. And they talk about in the question here, the elephant in the room, CRT, critical race theory. Well, let's talk a little more about what has really been the complaints about, that. But we're talking about equity. We're talking about specific equity programs here. And one of the issues there, I think, was parent involvement and transparency. So let me ask our panel about their programs and how they're moving their programs forward. Can you share with us how you are or how you have already done your planning, what you've done to involve and educate other stakeholders about this work, specifically students, parents, staff, community members, and the board? And so, Tony, do you have any thoughts that you could share with us on this point?
Sure. I'll start with our staff. So like I said, we've been doing this work for the last 6 to 7 years. And for a few years, a lot of it was conversation. And our motto at Palatine was the conversation is the work, because people were wondering, what's next? What's next? What are the strategies I need in my classroom to do this work? And we said, right now, the conversation is the work. And we did that for a number of years. But, we wanted to, a lot of people just kept saying, we want to see where the rubber meets the road, right? So we started looking at ways to implement this in our classrooms, right? So we started looking at culturally responsive teaching and the brain, culturally responsive teaching in the brain by Zaretta Hammond. We're actually using that as our part of our professional development for our staff this year, doing a book exploration during revolving meeting times this year. We also have a focus on social emotional learning that all relates to equity, right? All of those things, culture response teaching, social emotional learning, it's all related to equity. So we have a visual that one day maybe I can share with you that shows our triangle of how this looks, and it's all interrelated, right? So our staff is well aware of what we're doing, and they're heavily involved. We have our more involved staff that are part of our committees. We have about 50 that are part of our school-based committee. I think each school has about that number. So they're very much aware of our drive towards equity and also our focus on that professional development. But also we have, in terms of our students and parents, they've been heavily involved in the work. Not a lot of those parents or students, it's only a couple per school, but we're working towards having affinity groups for our parents that'll give them a voice and get connected and have connections with an administrator who meets with them on a monthly basis just to inform them of the work, but also to provide us feedback on what we need to do differently. So in terms of the board, we have 2 members from the Board of Education, and that's because of regulation. I believe there's only a certain amount of board members that can be a part of something because of the Open Meetings Act. So we have 2 board members who are on the District Equity Committee who we work with, and they communicate the feedback to the rest of the board through email, I believe, during the meetings as well. They give committee updates. And also the Board of Education and the community receives twice a year district equity committee updates to keep them informed of the progress, what we're doing, what we're focusing on at each school. And that just gives transparency, like you said, transparency to the board, but also transparency to the community on what we're doing as a school and district.
Thank you. Rob, any efforts from your district in this on this subject?
Yeah, so our district mission statement is all about providing a caring and challenging environment for all students. And that's really what has centered our equity work on this idea Tony was talking about a sense of belonging. So all of our work is about getting to know each student, getting to know their needs, and then making adaptations and quick pivots to meet the needs of the students. So in terms of communication and how we communicate out, that's just naturally tied into board presentations on a regular basis, because everything that we do in the district is about belonging and meeting the needs of students. In particular around equity, periodically throughout the year, we give formal presentations to the board. I'm really looking forward to entering into our strategic planning this year, because that gives us an opportunity to engage with a wider audience, to engage with our community and our caregivers and our students, who we usually don't get the opportunity to engage with. And for them to look at the recommendations for our equity audit, have them process those. And then what I'm really interested in is for, after they get done looking at that, to let us know what didn't the equity audit pick up. You know, there's limits to every bit of research. So what did that person miss that might not have surfaced during that audit? And it's important that we spend time talking to people and understanding those, so we can build those into our long-term plan. So that's what I'm looking forward is wrapping all of this into our strategic planning process.
Thank you. Shawn, any thoughts from your district?
Yeah, we've really been trying to take an experiential approach to communicate what it is we're doing. So with students, we've been holding affinity group meetings for students for about 2 years now to help explain the work and get feedback on what we've been doing. And last year, each of the buildings developed SOAR groups, student-generated, student-led, that's students organized against racism. We started engaging staff in the equity conversations in about 2019. So we've had 4 seed cohorts that have finished. I think we're in our 4th seed cohort. So we have some district teachers who've been trained to be seed facilitators. So they're doing that. And we've had PD as well for our teaching staff through Courageous Conversations. So last year we did some remote learning. We continue that again this year. And that's really, you know, a coalition of the interested. We haven't really made this a mandatory topic for teachers, but it's definitely the opportunity for them to come and understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. We also did some district-wide PD with Laurie's Children's Hospital last year on gender identity. So we've been taking little sessions like that. When it comes to parents and the board, these are the areas that we really need to get together and start to really work on. Maine South has started some equity PD sessions with a small group of parents who are interested. We're going to learn from that and see if we can expand that to the other buildings. But really where we need to do a lot more work is with our board. Our board is on board with the concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we really haven't done the actual started the personal journeys with board members. And like I think I alluded to before, I think that's where the real understanding comes in and starts to separate this sort of what might be in the popular media about critical race theory or culturally responsive teaching from what it really is all about equity and student voice and inclusion. So that's kind of where we are right now in our journey and the things that we've been doing.
Very helpful. I think it's helpful on the next subject, and that is, I did work in the school district. I was in-house counsel, so we were always trying to be proactive. Often you have to be reactive. So the question is, in addition to the work that you are doing to create an inclusive culture, to what extent are you planning proactively for how to respond if or when there's an incident of harassment or hate speech or something that really breaks the norms? Rob, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so part of our equity work has involved students. As Shawn was talking about a little bit there, we have a cohort of students who we refer to as the change makers, and they go through some learning together, which is all empathy-based, getting to know each other, recognizing that many times students pod themselves and don't interact outside of those pods. And so creating spaces for them to talk with each other, to understand each other, and to learn from each other in a way that they normally wouldn't throughout their daily lives in the schools. So when the leadership of our equity work moved to the buildings, one really great gem that came out of there was what they refer to as the bias incident plan. So rather than waiting for something to happen and then scrambling to figure out how to respond, they put together a plan on what steps they should take and what stakeholders they should engage in order to respond to that. And that's linked to the students because those student change makers are many times part of that plan. So in preparation for an incident like that to happen, we know the students that we would go to get some feedback, to get a pulse of how the student body is doing and any actions that we have to take. So I think that was a really great thing. We've already used it a few times and it's proven to be very effective.
Shawn, have you had any experience with this subject?
Yes, we actually did. One of the first things we produced, very similar to what Rob talked about, was a document for response to hate, racism, and discrimination. One of the things we found was when something like that happens outside of the norm, people want to hear from administration immediately. And very often you need to take some time and parse through what actually happened to get it right. And so we produce that so that it's a document that everyone knows when something like this happens, these are the steps we take, this is the process we go through. And so if there's a question, well, what are you doing about this? Here it is. This is the document we're following. So know that we're going through this process right now, and that communication, what you're looking for will be, comes out in about step 5 of the process. So we've done that. And then we've done a lot of work in restorative practices and restorative justice. And so we're at different places in the buildings on circle trainings, and just using that as something that's almost daily, done daily with our teachers in classes. We do it in our advisory system as a proactive measure. But what that also does is set the stage for having a conversation with staff and students when something does happen. And so we know there's a protocol that we follow. We want to make sure that the victims have a voice and that their voice is heard and that their perspective is understood. And so doing that work with the restorative practices has given us kind of a default setting to have those conversations rather than just, okay, this happened, here's a statement to read in your class today about incident X, Y, or Z. I think we're not there, but we're getting better at having teachers be able to and administrators be able to actually lead a session on processing the event as a step towards healing, as opposed to just, yes, it happened, yes, we're against it, and let's hope it never happens again. So
these are excellent comprehensive approaches. Tony, any thoughts from your end?
Very similar. I love the title of the bias incident report, like that approach. I think it's great. I think one of the things that we have very similar approaches, you guys, involving our principals, our counseling staff, to make sure that we're communicating with students on any major incidents, communicating with the parents as well. And I communicate with the district communications director just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what is going out to our parents. But I think the part that we're missing that I really want to focus on is how to get more input from our kids. I think they're our most important stakeholders. They have the pulse of the student body. So I think that's something that we're working towards and trying to get students more involved in the process as best as we can, because I know sometimes these situations can be difficult to work through, but I think the student piece is where we want to start focusing on more as a district.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are great responses. And it's really interesting to hear how you're, as opposed to managing students during the kind of aftermath of something like this, really involving them in how things unfold afterwards and how to be part of that healing process. At the same time, Mike, I know in a situation like that, there could be potential legal liability that districts are going to be concerned about. Are there particular legal considerations that schools should think about when responding to this type of harassment or hate speech?
Yeah, I think there are 3 points I'd like to share with the audience today. One is, is it a hate crime? Once it comes in, it may not simply be an internal school matter. And so it's important, work with your resource officer, maybe check in with your police contact to see whether or not they want to get involved, because some of these incidents could be very serious. The second issue, should there be some interim measure taken for the safety of the students and the victims? because people want to be safe. They want to be able to come back and feel safe in the classroom. So that's another piece I think to consider. And then finally, I think you've already said this, communication. Let everybody know we know about this incident. We are reviewing this incident. We take these very serious. I think those three initial items will put the districts in a good place when this incident occurs.
Thanks, Mike. Well, maybe, to close us out here, maybe we talk a bit about some of the obstacles that you all have encountered in this work. And maybe if you could talk a bit about what are some of those, bigger obstacles that you've faced, were they what you expected, and ways that you've addressed those challenges or plan to do so. Would be great to hear that perspective. Shawn, do you want to start?
Obstacles, misunderstanding, fake news, and 400 plus years of white supremacy. It's just, you put this out there in the community, and you're shocked sometimes by what you receive back. But that understanding equity is an extremely personal journey. It's not something you can just read about and say, oh, okay, I got it. It's a lot of work that requires you to be self-reflective and vulnerable, and they are not things that we do well in American society or teach people to do very well. So most of our adults need to dig into the work themselves and meet them where they are, and they come along at different paces. And so, doing the work truly changes your personal sense of self and identity. And it's challenging for people to go there. And so I think the biggest obstacle is just, it's so complex. The thing we're trying to address is so embedded in our culture and society that it's a long journey, and it takes time. And, it's probably something that when I retire, we'll still be working on, I would imagine. And so that I think is the biggest obstacle, is that it's just such complex work, and trying to meet folks where they are and not get frustrated when they don't see things the way you do, and keep after it.
Thanks for that, Shawn. Tony, do you want to talk a bit about some of the challenges you faced?
Sure, I can echo what Shawn says. I'll get a little bit more like a detail as what we're seeing in the classroom, right? So I think one of the priorities that we got from our audits is the diversification of our curriculum, right? To connect with the diverse student population that each of our schools have. I think our departments are doing a great job adjusting our critical learning standards, adjusting the state standards. But as we've tried to be more inclusive, it's also brought up, some negativity and people talking about, some of the things. I think somebody mentioned critical race theory earlier. Even though it's not a part of any of our critical learning standards, there are times where it does come up in class and we have to address it. And I think it's really made teachers a little bit more nervous, because we want them to put themselves out there. We want them to use different materials that are going to reach more kids, but at times they're controversial. So what we've done to combat that is providing, looking at a district board policy to review what it looks like. And a lot of it talks about indoctrination. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the indoctrination, that, teachers are not supposed to indoctrinate kids. And that's been our focus, is giving kids a voice, giving kids both sides to everything, but also supporting teachers who have grown to feel nervous about what they're doing in the classroom. I apologize, that's our bell that's ringing right now. But I think, the department chair is connecting with me just to make sure that their staff is being supported on that, has been very valuable. But I think diversifying the curriculum has definitely been our battle right now, or challenge.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, our biggest challenge has been the scaling up of taking this work and from our small equity committee up to all staff. And so one of the scale up challenges is the facilitation of learning. So we know that, similar to what Shawn was saying, is that equity work is a very personal journey. And so we know that cramming everybody into a gym and having a consultant come in and talk to them for an hour is not going to do anything for us. And so we know that the learning has to be in small groups and sometimes on an individual basis. But we also don't have a large number of trained facilitators to be able to have all of our adults in an environment like that. So our first few years is we had our equity team and some additional staff willing to facilitate. But when it comes into difficult conversations, our adults are very, very skilled and confident in navigating that conversation with a student. But when it comes to navigating that conversation with a peer, they get very nervous because, that's one of their colleagues. And so we have a cohort now of our staff who's going through some training this year on leading those conversations, navigating them, handling them with professionalism, so that way they're more confident. And then we have a larger cohort who then can push in, and we can have smaller groups learning for our PD related equity. So our biggest is the scaling up. And also, as we decentralize the leadership structure of it, we sometimes forget that we have to keep going back to remind people of the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because they don't necessarily get that message, but those who are in the weeds in this work inherently understand the why. We just have to do a better job of consistently communicating that to them.
Great. Well, we want to thank each of you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our listeners. We're so grateful to each of our administrators joining us today, Tony, Shawn, and Rob, for sharing your experiences and insights with us. If listeners do have questions or want to discuss how to tackle this work as an administrator and district, please reach out to Tony, Rob, and Shawn, who are happy to continue the discussion. And if you have any legal questions or concerns, please always feel free to reach out to any of our attorneys at Franczek. We do know this work is a process, and we want to make this an ongoing conversation. So please do reach out and let us know if you have any questions or topics that you think we should address, or if your district is doing good work that you want to highlight. You can also share this session with your colleagues. We will be sharing the recording, and it'll be available on our Franczek website, as well as on our Education Law Insights podcast. And additionally, if you missed our prior webinars in this series, you can find them all on the Franczek website under events or in the podcast, or you can feel free to reach out to one of us individually, and we can pass along the links to those. Our sessions in the past have been dedicated to particular topics such as special education, student discipline, English language learners, and hiring and retention, among others. So please join us again in November for our next equity webinar. And thank you again for being part of this effort and for the work that you're all doing to educate all students. Thank you.